Hi, I'm Heather Thompson in Montreal, and I'm reading Chapter 34 of Jane of Lantern Hill by Ella Montgomery. Grandmother coldly told Mother to buy what clothes, if any, were necessary for Jane. Jane and Mother had a happy afternoon shopping. Jane picked her own things that would suit Lantern Hill and an island summer. Mother insisted on some smart little knitted sweaters and one pretty dress of rose-pink organdy with delicious frills. Jane didn't know where she would ever wear it. It was too ornate for the little South Church, but she let Mother buy it to please her. And Mother got her the niftiest little green bathing suit. Just think, reflected Jane happily, in a week I'll be on Queen's Shore. I hope the water won't be too cold for swimming. We may be going to the island in August, said Phyllis. Dad says he hasn't been down for so long he'd like to spend another vacation there. If we do, we'll be stopping at the Harbour Head Hotel, and it isn't very far from there to Queen's Shore. So we'll likely see you. Jane didn't know whether she liked this idea or not. She didn't want Phyllis there, patronizing the island, looking down her nose at Lantern Hill and the boot shelf and the snowbeams. Jane went to the Maritimes with the Randolphs this year, and they left on the morning train instead of the night. It was a dull, cloudy day, but Jane was so happy she positively radiated happiness around her like sunshine. Mrs. Randolph's opinion of Jane was the very opposite of what Mrs. Stanley's had been. Mrs. Randolph thought she had never met a more charming child, interested in everything, finding beauty everywhere, even in those indeterminable stretches of pulpwood lands and lumber forests in New Brunswick. Jane studied the timetable and hailed each station as a friend, especially the ones with quaint, delightful names. Red Pine, Bardabog, Memramcook, and then Sackville, where they left the main line and got on the little branch train to Cape Tormentine. How sorry Jane felt for anyone who was not going to the island. Cape Tormentine, the car ferry, watching for the red cliffs of the island. There they were. She had really forgotten how red they were. And beyond them, misty green hills. It was raining again, but who cared? Everything the island did was right. If it wanted to rain, why, rain was Jane's choice. Having left Toronto on the morning train, they were in Charlottetown by mid-afternoon. Jane saw Dad the moment she stepped off the train, grinning and saying, "Excuse me, but your face seems familiar. Are you by any chance—" But Jane had hurled herself at him. They had never been parted. She had never been away at all. The world was real again. She was Jane again. Oh, Dad, Dad. She had been afraid Aunt Irene would be there too. Possibly Miss Lillian Morrow as well. But Aunt Irene, it transpired, was away on a visit to Boston and had taken Miss Morrow with her. Jane secretly hoped that Aunt Irene would be having such a fine time in Boston that she wouldn't be able to tear herself away for a long time. "And the car has turned temperamental again," said Dad. "I had to leave it in the garage at the Corners and borrow Steppyard's horse and buggy. Do you mind?" Mind? Jane was delighted. She wanted that drive to Lantern Hill to be so slow that she could drink the road in as she drove along. And she liked to be behind a horse. You could talk to a horse as you never could to a car. The fact was, if Dad had said they had to walk to Lantern Hill, it wouldn't have mattered to Jane. Dad put lean, strong hands under her arms and swung her up to the buggy seat. "Let's just go on from where we left off. You've grown since last summer, my Jane." "An inch," said Jane proudly. It had stopped raining. The sun was coming out. Beyond the white wave crests on the harbour were laughing at her, waving their hands at her. "Let's go uptown and buy our house some presents, Jane." "A double boiler that won't break, Dad. Poodles always did, a little. And a potato ricer. Can we get a potato ricer, Dad?" Dad thought the budget would stretch to a potato ricer. It was delightful, all of it. but Jane sparkled when they had left town behind them, going home to all the things they loved. "Drive slow, Dad. I don't want to miss anything on the road." She was feasting her eyes on everything: spruce-clad hills, bits of gardens full of unsung beauty tucked away here and there, glimpses of sparkling sea, blue rivers. Had those rivers really been so blue last summer? It had been an early spring and all the blossom show was over. Jane was sorry for that. She wondered if she would ever be able to get to the island in time to see the Titus lady's famous cherry walk in its spring blow. They called for a moment to see Mrs. Meade, who kissed Jane and was sorry Mr. Meade couldn't come out to see her because he was in bed with an abyss in his ear. She gave them a packet of ham sandwiches and cheese to stay their stomachs if they were hungry on the road. They heard the ocean before they saw it. Jane loved the sound. It was as if the spirit of the sea called to her. And then the first snuff of salt in the air. There was one particular hill where they always got the first tang. And from that same hill they caught their first faraway glimpse of Lantern Hill. It was wonderful to be able to see your own home so far off, to feel that every step the horse took was bringing you nearer to it. From there on, Jane was on her own stamping ground. It was so exciting to recognize all the spots along the road, green wood lanes, old beloved farms that held out their arms to her. The single row of spruces was still marching up Little Donald's Hill, the dunes, and the fishing boats sailing in, and the little blue pond laughing at her, and Lantern Hill, home after exile. Somebody, Jane discovered later it was the Snowbeams, had made welcome with white stones in the walk. Happy was waiting for them in the yard and nearly ate Jane alive. Bubbles, the new fat white dog, sat apart and looked at her, but he was so cute that Jane forgave him on the spot for being Bubbles. The first thing was to visit every room, and every room welcomed her back. Nothing was changed. She looked the house over to make sure nothing was missing. The little bronze soldier was still riding on his bronze horse, and the green cat kept watch and ward over Dad's desk. But the silver needed polishing, and the geraniums needed pruning, and when had the kitchen floor been scrubbed? She had been away from Lantern Hill for 9 months, but now it seemed to her that she had never been away at all. She had really been living here all along. It was her spirit's home. There were a bunch of little surprises, nice surprises. They had 6 hens. There was a small hen house built below the garden. There was a peaked porch roof built over the glass-paned door, and Dad had got the telephone in. First Peter was sitting on the doorstone when Jane came downstairs, with a big mouse in his mouth, very proud of his prowess as a hunter. Jane pounced on him, mouse and all, and then looked around for Second Peter. Where was Second Peter? Dad put his arm closely around Jane. Second Peter died last week, Jane. I don't know what happened to him. He got sick. I had the vet for him, but he could do nothing. Jane felt a stinging in her eyes. She would not cry, but she choked. I didn't think anything I loved could die, she whispered into Dad's shoulder. Ah, Jane, love can't fence out death. He had a happy life, if a short one, and we buried him in the garden. Come out and see the garden, Jane. It burst into bloom as soon as it heard you were coming. A wind ran through the garden as they entered it, and it looked as if every flower and shrub were nodding a head or waving a hand at them. Dad had a corner where vegetables were all up in neat little rows, and there were new beds of annuals. Miranda got what you wanted from the seedsman. I think you'll find everything, even the scabiosa. What do you want with scabiosa, Jane? It's an abominable name. Sounds like a disease. Oh, the flowers are pretty, Dad, and there are so many nicer names for them. Lady's Pincushion and Morning Bride. Aren't the pansies lovely? I'm so glad I sowed them last August. You look like a pansy yourself, Jane. That red-brown one there. with the golden eyes. Jane remembered she had wondered if anyone would ever compare her to a flower. In spite of the little pile of shore stones under the lilac, which young John had piled over the grave of 2 Peter, she was happy. Everything was so lovely. Even Mrs. Big Donald's washing, streaming gallantly out against the blue sky on her hilltop, was charming. And away down by the watchtower the surf was breaking on the sand. Jane wanted to be out in that turmoil and smother of the waves, but that must wait till morning. Just now there was supper to be gotten. How jolly to be in the kitchen again, thought Jane, girding on an apron. I'm glad my cook is back, said Dad. I've practically lived on salt codfish all winter. It was the easiest thing to cook. But I don't deny the neighbors helped the commissariat out. And they've sent in no end of things for our supper. Jane had found the pantry full of them. A cold chicken from the Jimmy Johns, a pat of butter from Mrs. Big Donald, a jug of cream from Mrs. Little Donald, some cheese from Mrs. Snowbeam, some rose-red early radishes from Min's Ma, a pie from Mrs. Bell. She said she knew you could make as good pies as she can, but she thought it would fill in till you'd had time to make some. There's a goodish bit of jam left yet, and practically all the pickles. Jane and Dad talked as they ate supper. They had a whole winter of talk to catch up with. Had he missed her? Well, had he now? What did she think? They regarded each other with great content. Jane saw the new moon over her right shoulder through the open door, and Dad got up and started the ship clock. Time had begun once more. Jane's friends, having considerately let her have her first rapture over, came to see her in the evening. The big, brown, rosy Jimmy Johns, and the Snowbeams, and Min, and Ding Dong. They were all glad to see her. Queen's Shore had kept her in its heart. It was wonderful to be somebody again. Wonderful to be able to laugh all you wanted to without anyone resenting it. Wonderful to be among happy people again. All at once, Jane realized that nobody was happy at 60 Gay, except perhaps Mary and Frank. Grandmother wasn't. Aunt Gertrude wasn't. Mother wasn't. Steppyard whispered to her that he had brought over a wheelbarrow load of sheep manure for her garden. You'll find it by the gate. Nothing like well-rotted sheep manure for a garden. Ding Dong had brought her a kitten to replace 2 Peter, a scrap about as big as its mother's paw, but which was destined to be a magnificent cat in black with 4 white paws. Jane and Dad tried out all kinds of names on it before they went to bed, and finally agreed on Silverpenny because of the round white spot between its ears. To go to her own dear room, where a young birch was fairly poking an arm in through the window from the steep hillside, to hear the sound of the sea in the night, to waken in the morning and think she would be with Dad all day. Jane sang the song of the morning stars as she dressed and got breakfast. The first thing Jane did after breakfast was to run with the wind to the shore and take a wild, exultant dip in the stormy waves. She fairly flung herself into the arms of the sea. What a forenoon it was, polishing silver and window panes. Nothing had changed, really, though there were surface changes. Steppyard had grown a beard because of throat trouble. Big Donald had repainted his house. The calves of last summer had grown up. Little Donald was letting his hill pasture go spruce. It was good to be home. Timothy Salt is going to take me cod fishing next Saturday, Dad. And that concludes Chapter 34.